Monday morning introduction to philosophy. If you're joining me for the very first time, this is a weekly open access live lecture that I record for anybody who wants to join. They're designed for beginners, but also slightly more advanced learners, so you can really pick up wherever you want. And today I'm going to be explaining Žižek's idea of the plague of fantasies, which is also the title of one of his books. Along the way, we're going to learn about a whole bunch of different things related to cinema and art and literature. So if you are new to philosophy and theory, fret not. I also want to say a huge thank you to our patrons here on YouTube, as well as our subscribers on Instagram who allow me to keep hosting these open access lectures in the first place. It simply would not be possible without your generous support. So thank you so much. And if you'd like to access my Introduction to Žižek ebook titled And Yet It Moves, you can find that on Patreon by going to www.patreon.com/Jeneline and Julian. And if you'd like to access bite-sized introductions to philosophy, I also post 60-second clips to my Instagram subscription. Again, thank you to all the patrons and the subscribers who keep this project alive and well. I'd also like to briefly ask that you give me a comment. I already see one up here, letting me know where you're joining me from. I see Denmark, I see Slovenia. That makes me very happy. Thank you guys so much. It's wonderful to know that we're connecting across the world. I see Eindhoven. Hello, Eindhoven. That's absolutely wonderful. Poland. Beautiful. That makes me very, very happy. Thank you for sharing that. Virginia. Okay, excellent. Ukraine, hello Ukraine, hope that you are well. Texas, Malaysia, Brazil, Ethiopia, that's incredible. Thank you guys so much. I really, really appreciate that. So today I want to talk about a couple things. I'd like to introduce you to the idea of the plague of fantasies, which is a title from one of Slavoj Žižek's books on psychoanalysis. Along the way, we're going to learn about the objet A, what Žižek calls the three modes of the objet A, which are, I need to remember, subtraction, protraction, and abstraction. Protraction, subtraction, and abstraction. And then we're going to do a whole bunch of other things along the way. We're going to talk about Žižek's critique of ideology and how it relates to the idea of the plague of fantasies. If you're new here, make yourself comfortable. I mean, it doesn't matter. Anybody should make themselves comfortable. I'm going to be here for about 45 to 50 minutes. So settle right in. Yes, these lectures are recorded. You can watch them anytime you want. They're going to be saved for free on Instagram and on YouTube. Plus, you can download them as an audio file by going to my Patreon, where I post all of my lectures. And I've been doing this for 2.5 years now. So there's a lot of lectures. There's more than 100 lectures that you can access as a patron right now. Okay, let's begin. Dramatic sip. So I'd like to start with what Slavoj Žižek calls the plague of fantasies, which is actually a title that he takes from a Petrarch text called My Secret. And My Secret is a little bit like the Confessions. It's the similar kind of self-inquiry or self-investigation in which Petrarch talks about the plague of fantasies that torment him, that come at him. And Žižek uses as a basic example, he says, a plague of fantasies could be the sort of hysterical questioning that ensues when you know that your partner has cheated on you. Imagine that your partner has cheated on you and you try to be a compassionate, understanding partner. You say, I understand, these things happen, we love each other, we'll make mistakes, we can simply go on with our life. And yet, you will nevertheless start wondering, how did it happen? With whom did it happen? When and how often did it happen? And as soon as you start pressing your partner for details about this, you're giving yourself what you think you want, and yet the more you receive what you think you want, in other words, the information about the transgression, the more pain you suffer. I think anybody who's been jealous has experienced this. It might even be in a new relationship where you ask your partner about their previous relationships and you're very curious and you really want to know who they've been with and what it was like. And yet the more they say, every word cuts you like a fresh wound. And this kind of slightly masochistic behavior by which you are plagued by fantasies, which is that you can no longer simply go through your ordinary life because now you're constantly asking yourself these details, or you're envisioning them, whereby your previous enjoyment of your life or your relationship has been ruined by this aggressive attack of these fantasies, these intrusive thoughts that you have, is what Žižek therefore refers to as the plague of fantasies. Now, this is, of course, a mere example. He has a much larger theoretical argument in mind about this. But the plague of fantasies relates to Žižek's argument about ideology. Žižek essentially says that what ideology does is that it gives us pre-packaged fantasies. Essentially, that it gives us sort of a collective fantasy that we can all enjoy in order to be safe from the plague of fantasies. That on a very basic level, what ideology does is that ideology structures the chaos of reality with a kind of overarching frame, a kind of way of viewing the world so that everything makes sense, so that you can participate in it. For Žižek, and this is something that he takes from Lacan and from Freud, from Lacanian Freudian psychoanalysis, subjectivity is inherently hysterical. This means that the subject doesn't know who he is or what he wants. Instead, he has to find a way to frame who he is and what he wants. From a Lacanian perspective, reality isn't a priori. In other words, reality isn't simply an objective neutral substance, and fantasy, therefore, is a kind of coping mechanism by which we try to deal with the horror of reality an sich. For Lacan, instead, reality is a kind of hole, it's a kind of gap, it's an empty place that cannot be properly accessed. And the only way it can be accessed for Lacan is to access it through fantasy. In other words, from a Lacanian perspective, fantasy is not antithetical to reality, but constitutive of it. That without supplementing fantasy, reality is inaccessible to the subject. That is one of Lacan's central propositions. Žižek therefore argues that what ideology accomplishes is that it allows us to access reality in a certain way by giving us a pre-packaged, TV dinner version of what we can believe and imagine and fantasize about. That it provides us with the structure of a preordained fantasy system, ideology, by which we can imbue our life with meaning and purpose, etc. In other words, it provides the incentive structures by which we learn to live our life. Now, the critique of ideology is therefore, at its most elementary level, simply to ask, what are these fantasies that structure our reality, and who gets to dictate what those fantasies are? It's a very simple question. There's Kafka even, before we even have the contemporary critique of ideology, Kafka writes something similar about this in his diaries, where he says that sometimes the right way to examine something or to see something is to see it in the wrong way. Sometimes the right way to analyze something is to purposefully misinterpret it. And if you think about this, which seems like a paradoxical statement, right? Why would you analyze something properly by misanalyzing it? If you think about it, this is the central aspect of the Marxist critique of the commodity fetish. The critique of the commodity fetish always starts by saying, let's take a seemingly ordinary, non-important object, a seemingly meaningless object, a commodity, like a shoe, and let's take it too seriously. Let's analyze it. Let's start examining the way in which this seemingly ordinary shoe becomes imbued with mystical qualities. That's essentially the argument that Marx is making in his critique and theory of the commodity fetish, is that we imbue ordinary objects with seemingly super extraordinary value. That is the commodity fetish, that we take something ordinary and that by means of elevating it to an object of exchange, in other words, the abstract, the physical marker of an abstract exchange, which is delineated by value, we therefore have no longer simply what appears to us as mere objective neutral reality, namely the hard materialism of the shoe. We have something that seems to transcend it, something that becomes more valuable, something that has a surplus value, which becomes part of the commodity fetish. The argument here, therefore, is strictly speaking again that the best way to interpret something the right way is therefore to interpret it the wrong way. You don't simply pick up the shoe and you say, well, it's just a mere shoe, why would you pay attention to it? The central aspect of the Marxist critique is to say, no, let's take this shoe really seriously. let's identify the central symptom of all of contemporary modern industrialized life in the guise of this shoe. And if you go back to one of Žižek's other works, I believe it's in The Ticklish Subject, could also be The Sublime Object of Ideology, Žižek makes an argument which is that this basic procedural gesture, namely, let's misinterpret something, let's take something too seriously, as it were, can also be found in the Freudian dream analysis. Remember, the Freudian dream analysis always begins by taking that which appears trivial too seriously. The dream. A dream, like, think about it. A good test of whether or not you have intimacy with someone is whether or not you tell them your dream. It's something very intimate, but also something that appears to have no direct bearing on your reality. And yet distinctly different from the Jungian mechanism by which we find symbols and meanings in the dream, the Freudian inquiry, the hermeneutic principle of the Freudian dream analysis, the interpretation, is always to say, let's take the dream really seriously. However, let's not investigate the apparent content of the dream, namely what occurs in the dream. Let's investigate the underlying structure, the hidden structure, in other words, the hidden content in the form itself, by which this dream could appear to you in the first place. And now you can see the analogy, the analogous movement with the Marxist critique of the commodity fetish, which leads to the critique of ideology. It's never simply to say, let's analyze the objects in the world, let's take a shoe too seriously, let's conduct an entire study of the commodity. It's to say, what is the hidden content in the form? In other words, what had to occur in the first place for this commodity to appear as valuable to you? That is essentially what later would be called the hermeneutics of suspicion, which is another way of referring to the central characteristic of Marxism, the critique of ideology, which is never simply to elevate the formal content of the thing, but to look at the underlying content hidden in the form itself. In other words, it's not just what are the ideas of society, it is how is it that the ideas of the ruling class become naturalized as the ideas of society at large? How is it that the structural mechanisms and incentive structures of capitalism become accepted as the seemingly naturalized, most correspondingly to human nature principles of social life? Now, here again, we have essentially an overlap when it comes to Freud and Marx. If the central principle for Freud is to analyze the content of the dream, but to inquire into the hidden content in the form itself, one should therefore always make the argument that the critique of ideology is, strictly speaking, looking into the hidden content that lies within the form. Let me give you an example from Freud. Freud has a famous example from Freud. I was trying to think about which one I want to use. Would be if someone details their dream, explains their dream to Freud, she cannot properly reconstruct her dream. In other words, there are gaps in the dream. And the woman says, clearly I cannot remember what's in my dream. Does this gap mean that there's a gap in my existence, in my life? What does the gap symbolize? And from a Freudian perspective, the truth of the dream doesn't lie hidden behind these gaps. It's not that if you can remember that which you cannot forget, that if you remember that which you cannot tell, that you would find the secret of the dream. It's the other way around. It's that the truth of the dream lies precisely in that you cannot properly recount it. In other words, the dream does not have a missing content, some obscure meaning that is hidden through the poor recollection of the dream. Instead, the truth of the dream is precisely the poor recollection itself. In other words, it's not that the content of the dream is absent. It is that the hidden content in the form, namely the form in which it could not be properly accounted for, is precisely its truth. The fact that it could not be fully articulated is therefore the truth of the dream. The fragmentary nature of the dream, rather than being a detraction from its message, is itself the message. Once again, we're back at Kafka, who says that sometimes the right way to interpret something is to see it the wrong way around, to see that which it is not saying, as it were. Of course, contemporary post-Marxist and postmodern critiques sort of embrace this idea, but they universalize it, the idea of the voice of the voiceless and the part of no part, and so on and so forth. But we don't have to engage with that. Now, Žižek therefore takes the idea of the plague of fantasies, which he says is constitutive to the subject. Namely, we are plagued by fantasies. We can only access reality by means of imbuing it with fantasy. We enter into reality through subjective fantasy. And that therefore this pain, this plague of fantasies, of having to require some structuring mechanism by which we can order our fantasies in correspondence to a pre-given reality, is given to us conveniently by ideology. In other words, ideology is that which gives structure to the chaos of our desires. And of course, our desires are what make us plagued by fantasy. And here Žižek has an elementary formula of what he calls the three modes of desire, which relate to the Lacanian objet A, the famous objet petit a, being the object cause of desire. But we can get to that in a moment. I've also posted a 10-minute explainer for that on my channel. Now, the three modes that Žižek details are obstruction, protraction. Actually, I've written them down because I always get them in the wrong order. Subtraction, protraction, and obstruction. Subtraction, protraction, and obstruction. Now, if you want to just explain, if I want to explain briefly what these are, and then I'll give you some examples. The idea of subtraction is simply something which is missing. The object of your desire is absent. Protraction is that the span towards the object of desire has been lengthened. Žižek uses as an example here if you're watching a movie and the movie has a long static shot. Now, the long static shot will actually make itself known to you as its own signature style. And so you start looking for what it is trying to tell you, etc. It's something that Žižek takes from Tarkovsky, who once said that there's an invisible moment where if a shot is too long, the audience goes from being bored, namely why is nothing happening, to becoming intrigued, that the longness, the length of the shot becomes its own content, essentially. But we'll return to that. And then finally, obstruction. Obstruction means that something becomes the barrier to its own enjoyment. For example, you really want something, and as soon as you have it, you lose your enjoyment for it. Essentially, the victory of having it has already tarnished the thing from within. So let's come up with a couple of examples to illustrate this. We have subtraction. Subtraction is the absence of the object of desire. And now we should actually go back to the idea of hysteria. Remember I said that Žižek argues in a Lacanian fashion that the central characteristic of subjectivity is hysteria. Now, this is not the historical mode of hysteria by which many women were unjustly kept imprisoned or even institutionalized because they very correctly saw the oppressive state of their role that was expected from them in society. This is not hysteria in that sort of clinical sense. Instead, hysteria, from a Freudian Lacanian perspective, is always the question, what am I to the other? It's similar to the Sartrean idea that hell is other people. Remember, for Sartre, hell is other people, not because you don't like being with other people, it's because your very idea of subjectivity is overdetermined by others. Even the desire and the fantasy of being alone is always a fantasy to be undisturbed by the other. Therefore, the presence of the other remains there, except now in his absence, as it were. And if hysteria, in other words, the question of what am I to the other, is therefore constituted to subjectivity itself, this means that the hysterical subject has to find an answer of what is the other to me. And the easiest answer for the subject to escape his hysteria is simply to invert the question, to say, what am I to the other? In other words, to desubjectivize yourself on behalf of the other, to make yourself the object of the other's enjoyment. However, this is where Žižek cautions us. He says, here we have the elementary gesture of perversion. Perversion is not to access your own enjoyment directly. Perversion is to make yourself the agent of the other's pleasure. And Žižek says that this is the perverted element that exists within capitalist consumer society enjoyment. It's that the imperative is to enjoy yourself, to be happy, to be fulfilled. And yet all of us struggle to actually be happy, especially all the time. And so, for example, if you post on Instagram, if you post a picture of yourself happy with family or eating a delicious breakfast meal, you are strictly speaking acting in a perverted way, which is you are no longer enjoying the thing in the moment. You have to stage it for the gaze of the imaginary other through social media so that you can access your enjoyment. That is the stance of the pervert. It's to say, my enjoyment comes to me indirectly. It comes to me when I can stage it for the other. And here we can see the central distinction between the paranoiac and the pervert. Imagine a sexual encounter, again, plague of fantasies, in which someone who has a very strict parent or Christian upbringing or something like this engages in a sexual act with their partner. And yet they can't fully immerse themselves in the pleasure because there's a constant voice in the back of their head that's telling them that this is sinful, that they shouldn't be doing it, how could they revel in such pleasure, etc. And so there's something that keeps them from enjoying themselves, a kind of internalized gaze, a paranoiac stance towards their own pleasure that bars them from fully indulging themselves. Now, the switch here from the paranoiac to the pervert is that the pervert can only enjoy himself when he feels like he is doing it in the gaze or in the presence of the other. In other words, the pervert will actually create the imaginary other for which he can stage his transgression. I actually saw a beautiful example of this recently. And again, please note that I don't mean perversion here in a normative sense. I'm not judging anybody. I saw in the Instagram profile of the artist, singer and songwriter Amanda Palmer, I saw that she was releasing a piece of merch. And the piece of merch said something like, sing for all the teachers who told you you couldn't sing. Here we have the perfect illustration of the perverted form of enjoyment, which again, I'm not saying is a bad thing. You are singing, but the enjoyment of your singing constitutes the excessive pleasure of proving those who told you you couldn't sing wrong. It's a little bit like you see this on the internet sometimes, which is like the best way to recover from like the best revenge is to lead a good life. Again, while this may be true, we have, by the way, for context, the best revenge here implying that after a breakup or after someone has cheated on you, that the best revenge is to lead a good life. Let me clarify. Again, we have here essentially the perverted stance. The perverted stance is therefore that now I'm going to enjoy leading such a good and successful life to prove to you how much you've lost, to demonstrate to you how little your pain has deterred me, how I've taken the pain and turned it into pursuit, etc. Again, this doesn't have to be a bad thing. It can be a perfectly good coping mechanism, and yet fundamentally it follows the logical formula of the pervert, who accesses his enjoyment on behalf of the imaginary other. And I mean, if you think this to its logical conclusion, it becomes obscene. Imagine a couple breaks up when they're younger, and the man feels very aggrieved about this and decides that he's going to become, the most powerful man in the world, and becomes really rich and wealthy and powerful. And then one day, 40 years later, he comes across his former partner who's completely forgotten about him, who's living a perfectly happy existence somewhere in the suburbs. And he says, I did this all for you. It's a very melodramatic gesture, but it's precisely one of the sneaky ways in which joy or pleasure or in French, desire, the jouissance can be accessed by means of doing it on behalf of the imaginary other, the internalized gaze of the other. And Žižek's argument, to link this again to capitalism and the consumer society, is that this is what we see within contemporary life. If the example that he always uses is that if you go to a coffee shop and the coffee shop tells you that $1 out of every purchase goes towards eradicating global poverty or something like this, strictly speaking, it's not just virtue signaling. It is an aspect of perversion. Namely, I'm not simply enjoying the coffee for what it is. I'm enjoying the coffee as a gesture on behalf of the global poor, which of course is obscene if you think about it. It has nothing to do with actually examining the structural mechanisms by which your participation in a westernized consumer society actually contributes to the perpetuation of global poverty. Instead, it tells you self-congratulatory that not only are you enjoying your coffee, but you can access the surplus enjoyment of doing it on behalf of the global poor. That therefore charity, as Oscar Wilde already understood, that charity really benefits the rich more than it benefits the poor. I think I should also add here, perhaps on a side note, that we see something analogous in this to some of Mr. Beast's content, with the idea being that it gives and gives and gives and gives, but fundamentally it becomes an individual act of personal enrichment. But put that aside for all the fans of Mr. Beast. Now, here we have, I want to go back to subtraction. Subtraction is therefore the central formula of the objet A. The form of desire is that secretly you don't want to get what you think you want. Secretly you don't want to be happy. It's a central lesson of psychoanalysis that not only do you not know what you want, but secretly you don't want to get it. As soon as you access it, it's already lost. As soon as you've achieved the thing you thought you wanted, you've already lost the interest in it. This can be very dangerous in relationships. Like if you become someone, remember Kafka said that he couldn't properly love because he always placed the person he loved on a pedestal that was so high that he thought he could never reach it. Thereby, if he reached it, by means of having reached it, it loses the essential characteristic of why it was desirable in the first place. This is, of course, a trap. If you make something desirable because you think you cannot have it, again, a plague of fantasy, right? The plague of fantasies is to say, what do you want? Well, you want that which you cannot have. As soon as you have it, you therefore no longer want it. Haha, the plague of fantasies has returned to bite you. The central principle, though, of subtraction, namely the absence of the object of desire, can also be found in religion and faith. After all, what is faith, if not the idealization of something which, as its very central characteristic, cannot be accessed directly, cannot be properly realized or found? In fact, if God suddenly appeared in the world and walked up to you and said, "Hello, I am God, I have come here to announce myself," you would probably be correct in saying, "Get the hell away from me, you are going to destroy religion." That if God suddenly came to us and spoke to us directly, the very founding mechanism of religion, of the faith, would fade away. That God's presence would thereby be the central catalyst of the destruction of the entire idea of religiosity in the first place, which is built around the idea of this gap between the subject and the God of the beyond. It's also, if you've watched my previous videos, it's also why the New Testament remains so revolutionary. In the crucifixion, we have therefore the transposition of the gap between God and man transposed back into man himself. As Hegel once said, what dies on the cross is not Christ. What dies on the cross is the God of the beyond, this central hierarchy by which we have the lost subject who has been kicked out of paradise, who's trying to be reunited with the higher deity, as it were. Subtraction, therefore, functions in an analogous way to the faith, which is the question of God is not simply his inexistence, it is the immutable presence of his absence. And there's a great example of this, actually, in the series Watchmen, which aired on HBO a couple of years ago. And in The Watchmen, we have Dr. Manhattan, who is a godlike, a deity-like figure who is all-powerful, can bend the very, nature of time and space, etc. And one day he disappears. He simply leaves. It's, the death of God, etc. Dr. Manhattan is gone. And on Earth, people create a kind of intergalactic phone booth system where people can go into the phone booth and they can record a message for Dr. Manhattan that is broadcast into the vast expanses of space. Essentially, it's a secular form of prayer, right? It is, I'm going to send a message that I think will not arrive. Of course, in classically Lacanian terms, we have here, of course, the letter that nevertheless reaches its intended destination, namely the true import, the destination of the letter is precisely that it is not ever accepted, that it is not ever sent to the addressee, that the nature of prayer, therefore, is not simply a missive to God directly. Hello, God, I would like you to do X for me. Otherwise, we'd be stuck in the principle of antiquity, the relationship between God and man, which, as you will recall, was do ut deut. I give so that I might receive, or I give so that I might be given. Instead, we have the properly hysterical gesture of the message that is intended to fail to receive its recipient. That you are praying, but you are praying without expecting to receive an answer. And of course, the cataclysmic act, the opening, if you will, disaster of the show, of the series, which I highly recommend, is of course that God does listen, that Dr. Manhattan does receive a message, and therefore everything starts to unravel. Again, we can go back to Kafka. Kafka saying that sometimes the right way to see something is to see it the wrong way is similar to the letter that reaches its destination precisely by failing to reach it. In other words, the true message of the letter was not that it was supposed to be accepted by Dr. Manhattan, but precisely that it was supposed to remain inept, that it was supposed to never reach its true destination. The show is The Watchmen on HBO. Highly recommend. Now, we can extend this to the idea of protraction. Protraction being the secondary formula that Žižek has for the object of desire. One sec. Protraction is the idea that one of the central characteristics of being subject, of being alive, human, is that when we cannot access something, when the object of our desire is barred from us, that at a certain point, this protraction becomes itself pleasurable. That if, as I said before, if the central idea of subtraction is that we cannot enjoy the thing directly, that as soon as we have it, we've therefore lost our enjoyment of it, that the way to work around this problem is to enjoy the process of not obtaining it. This is the Wiederholungszwang, the repetition compulsion that is a central characteristic of human neurosis, which is to say that it's precisely by not completing a thing, by not acquiring it, by not having it, but perpetually moving towards it, that we therefore stage our own pleasure in our own impossibility. It's like the famous Beckett line, fail, fail again, fail better. And you'll even find this from self-help gurus on the internet who essentially tell you that it's all about process and it's not about the outcomes, and that the journey is itself the reward, and all these true isms, which are of course true, but they're nevertheless slightly banal, which doesn't make them untrue. Many banalities can be true. This is like clear. The central idea, therefore, is that one of the features of human subjectivity, which makes it hysterical again, is to say that we enjoy more not getting the thing than we enjoy getting the thing. But of course, if we're simply denied the thing that we want, then we're going to be unhappy. If someone simply tells you, we're going to want it more. If somebody tells you, here's a car, and you are never allowed to have this car, under no circumstances will you ever have a car, haha, then you will really want that car. You might actually dedicate your whole life to getting the car. It's one of the, again, this is the plague of fantasies, is why would you dedicate your life towards obtaining X? Well, it's because somebody's told you that you cannot have X. It's a very sad state of affairs if you think about it. However, the properly masochistic enjoyment that you can derive is precisely the enjoyment from not getting it, but feeling like you are moving towards getting it. One of the sad truisms about American life is the idea that nobody thinks that they're poor, that everybody thinks that they're on their way to getting rich. And of course, this is, again, one of the ways in which you precisely cope with being poor. Nobody just thinks to themselves, well, I am poor, and that's that. You think of yourself, well, I may be poor now, but tomorrow I'll be slightly less poor, etc. And so on the ladder of your own perceived wealth, your social ascension, you are simply thinking that you are one rung above the other. Again, we go back to the central critique, which is the Marxist critique. The critique of ideology is to say, what is the hidden content in the form itself? In other words, how is it that you've accepted that the ladder takes on the shape of a ladder? Who convinced you that there is such a thing as a social ascension by which we're all simply moving up rungs? What if the very idea of there being a neutral ladder of society that you can walk up is precisely how you remain forever barred from the higher echelons of society? It's also why Marx argued that the central principle of class consciousness is precisely not to ask for better representation or better wages, but to understand that in order for capitalism to be perpetuated, in other words, to continue to exist, requires the systematic exclusion, what today would be called systemic injustice, of worker exploitation. That therefore to alleviate worker exploitation and to allow them to become slightly richer would do nothing for workers. And of course, that's what we've seen in the 21st century, even in the late 20th century, which is that as workers have gained more access to leisure time and leisure commodities, it's the joke today, right? That even homeless people have an iPhone, etc. That structurally, nobody has actually benefited. In fact, injustice and inequality has massively increased since the 1980s. That's therefore the central Marxist argument about class consciousness. It's not realizing that you are a group that has to be represented better. It's realizing that your group is precisely unnatural. That it exists as a constitutive feature of capitalist exploitation. Now, again, we're back at Plague of Fantasies. Once you realize this, it's not a very pleasant realization. And so capitalism will sell back to you the fantasy of your own personal enrichment, that you are pulling yourself up by your bootstraps, that you could be a winner or a loser, and that the harder you work, the more you will be rewarded. And yet fundamentally, this isn't, think about it. One of the primary indicators of your personal wealth and your personal future is not how hard you work. One of the quote-unquote secrets of the rich, which you will see from many self-help gurus online, is precisely that their wealth is not attached to the physical labor, which is attached to the time that they are able to spend working. That wealth is precisely the kind of liquidity which famously was referred, you may have Sigmund Baumann referred to as liquid times, by which, as Marx once put it, everything that is solid melts into thin air, that wealth is precisely the abstraction from wealth. Think about really wealthy people who don't take a salary because they live entirely off the abstract value of what they own. In other words, a sign of wealth, again, you'll find this even from self-help gurus talking about this on the internet, a sign of wealth is not to say how much money do you have in the bank. A sign of wealth is to say how much are you worth? And how much are you worth is completely different from having money in the bank. In fact, you could even argue that a sign of poverty today, even the poverty of the middle classes, is that you rely on what is in the bank rather than all the loans that you can take out against your own wealth. And so there's a great meme about this. I think Jenilene shared this with me recently. I think it's like Smaug from The Hobbit. And Smaug is talking with Bilbo and he says, don't you know I take $1 salary every year or something like this, right? This is the hoarding instinct. It's not to say I have more money in my bank. It's to say I am worth more. And this worth becomes more and more abstract the higher it is. Which brings us back, of course, to what I started with in the lecture, which is the Marxist idea of looking at the commodity, which isn't to say let's just look at the shoe. It's to saying let's look at the process by which the abstract valuation of this shoe can become so enormous. Now, back to protraction. Protraction, therefore, is that we find a kind of perverse pleasure in the prolongation of our own dissatisfaction. That secretly what we desire is to remain unsatisfied. It's also Lacan's famous formula of desire. What we desire is desire itself. And think about it. If what you desire is desire itself, then the easiest way to become unsatisfied is to get the thing that you thought you wanted. As soon as you have it, you no longer want it. And so if you can perpetually defer the point of being happy, of having it, the happier you can be for the longer you can be. And the same, of course, is true when it comes to consumer society today. You buy an iPhone, you immediately want the next iPhone. You watch a Marvel movie. At the end of the Marvel movie, you have to stick around for the snippet that will show you why you should watch the next one. And let me tell you, I like Marvel movies, but none of them are that good. And so at the end of every Marvel movie, it's like the Kinder Egg that Žižek uses as an example of the objet A. It's you open the Kinder Egg and there's a toy inside, but the toy is kind of shitty, so then you eat the chocolate. The same is true with every Marvel movie. You go to the Marvel movie, it's exciting, but it's also kind of shitty. But then you have the little snippet that makes you excited about the next movie, and then you go to see that, and then that's kind of shitty too, and so on and so forth. You drag yourself along on the coattails of somebody else's fantasies that are being spoon-fed to you. In other words, the plague of fantasies, the way in which ideology pre-provides us with a kind of pre-packaged set of desires and fantasies that we can buy into, which of course bars us from having our own properly structured imagination and fantasies. That the most revolutionary act today is precisely to insist on your own intellectual property when it comes to your imagination, to dream your own dreams, not to dream somebody else's. Okay, now from protraction, let's go to abstraction. Abstraction is for Žižek the third category of the object of desire. Žižek says that one of the painful, this is not just Žižek, by the way. Actually, let's bench Žižek for a moment. Let's go to Proust. Proust has this as well. This is not Žižek's invention. Proust has a beautiful scene in Search of Lost Time. I think it's in Swann's Way. It's like at the very beginning, in which the young narrator, the narrator's not young, but he's recalling his youth as a very young man, a young boy, who idolizes art, who idolizes the theater, opera, etc. And he's very sensitive. He's a very sensitive young man. And one day, I think it's his uncle, takes him to the theater. It's a big deal. He finally gets to go to the theater. It's something he's wanted his whole life. However, it's a beautiful emotional realism, psychological realism in this passage. As soon as the little boy's in the theater, and as soon as the production begins, he starts suffering. He's not happy. Why is he not happy? It's because he has anticipated this moment for so long that every second of the production is already its own loss. That he is so focused on the play that he really, really wants to imbue every moment of its essence into him that he cannot actually enjoy it, that he's barred from it. It's one of the weird paradoxes of enjoyment is that if we try too hard to enjoy ourselves, we lose the thing we're supposed to enjoy. It's why birthdays are so dangerous. If on a birthday you really want to impress your partner, you want everything to be perfect, you're actually much more likely to end up fighting and having a bad day. It's the impossibility of heightened expectations. And so this little boy finds himself in the theater in a state of like neurotic overstimulation, where this thing that he desperately wants to enjoy, he cannot enjoy because he's so painfully self-aware of the fact that he's supposed to enjoy it. And he's almost relieved when it's over. He's completely overstimulated because it's like the thing that he dreamt of has finally passed, and now he can enjoy ruminating on it and enjoy remembering it. I'm convinced that this is how everybody is. It's like when you go to a concert and everybody's holding up their phone and they're filming it. It's not a bad thing. It's because we don't know how to access it directly. We're so excited to finally be at the Taylor Swift concert or whatever that we're just trembling. And so we hold up the phone because if we have the phone, then we've grasped it. It's like Walter Benjamin has this wonderful observation about art where he says that one of the central principles of modern art and the modern condition, apropos art, is that people want to hold it, that they want to hold on to it. By this I mean modernism. I mean like the emergence of a middle class in the late 19th century. I don't mean modern art as an abstract conceptual art. Benjamin says that the desire to hold onto art as a commodity, to have a reproduction of it in your room that you can therefore have as a souvenir from the time you visited the gallery, of course, corresponds with the emergence of a kind of middle class that engages in cultural tourism and the commodification of cultural events, which we see happening. It's also, I don't want to go too much on a sidebar here, but it's also the emergence of like tour guides that tell you exactly where to go and what to see and how to enjoy it, corresponds with this hysterical relationship and the imperative to enjoy that we find with the modern subject. If the middle class subject goes abroad to enrich themselves and to show their social status by means of engaging in the greatest works of art, of civilization, and so on and so forth, which really only starts to exist in the 19th century, you need a guide, someone you can trust, who will tell you that you have seen the right thing, that you didn't do it wrong, that you can go home feeling proud that in the 2 days that you spent in Rome, that you have seen the greatest of what there was to see, etc. There's so much beautiful writing from the 19th century from all these writers who are essentially making fun of tourists who exist in this kind of neurotic stance where it's like they have to make sure that they saw everything that was in the tour guide. It's like, unless it's in the tour guide, it doesn't exist. Of course, we still see this today. And of course, the brilliance of commodification is that today we have tour guides, like travel guides, I should say. Travel guides that promise you that you will see what no other travel guide shows you, or even better, that you will see the thing that tourists don't like. This is the new commodification of tourism, let's just be real. It's to say, all the tourists are doing X, but here's where you can find the real Scotland or the real Thailand or whatever. It's the central mechanism, it's simply being deferred. It's surplus enjoyment. It's the endless expanse of commodification that sort of parasitically preys upon itself. Now, this is for Žižek the obstruction of enjoyment, is that secretly enjoyment is barred to us because as soon as we have it, we no longer want it, but it's also that we enjoy this pain. We enjoy this neurotic picking at a scab. Does she love me? Does she not? Many people who are in love will never actually force the question because they so much enjoy hysterically observing the question, as it were. That the central enjoyment of infatuation isn't simply idealization, it's also the deferment of one's own pleasure. It's the impossibility of actually obtaining it. There's a train in the background. I don't know if you can hear that. And so you have to see these three as being linked. We have subtraction, namely the object of desire is hidden from us. We do not have it. What makes it desirable is that it is not there. It is the presence of its absence, if you will. Then we have protraction, which is the enjoyment that we derive from the pursuit itself, that its absence creates the space in which we can enjoy its absence. To make an aside here about religion, you could also see here being one of the central differences between Judaism and the Christian faith. It's all about the event of the arrival of the Messiah. In the Jewish faith, Christ has not yet come, strictly speaking. Christ is a false prophet. We're still waiting for the Messiah. And so everything can be arranged. Everyone has to follow the rules, as it were, so that when the Messiah comes, we will be ready. Here we have protraction. It has not yet happened. And so we have to be in a state of perpetual readiness. Whereas in the Christian faith, the central event of the faith has already happened. Christ has already come. And so we're left in this neurotic stance of obstruction, which is how do we enjoy the thing even though it has already happened? And of course, the answer for many sort of apocalyptic, doom-mongering Christians is, of course, to then defer this moment of arrival, this advent, if you will, back onto the apocalypse. That yes, Christ came, but what we're really waiting for are the signs of the apocalypse. And therefore, actually, I don't mean to be too provocative here, but if you are one of these apocalyptic thinkers, you've essentially taken the central principle of Judaism, you've ignored the innovation of the New Testament and of the Christian faith, which is the transposition of this deferred point of arrival into the idea of the human collective itself. In other words, you've simply turned your Christianity into a kind of vulgar Judaism. But again, I don't mean to offend. Although, yeah, I kind of do. But whatever. If you're an apocalyptic-minded person, good for you. And then finally, we have abstraction. Abstraction, again, being that we enjoy the immutable barrier of our own enjoyment. In other words, the pleasure of our own pain. That the secret is really that we enjoy our own suffering. I know it sounds vulgar, but it is true. This is why Žižek says enjoy your symptom. That your symptom is that which you pleasurably enjoy not enjoying. It's like, for example, a soccer player probably does not like running that much, but they like running that much if they're doing it for a cause, if they're doing it to win a trophy, etc. Now, of course, the naive stance is to say, well, it's just a trophy. Why would you spend your life kicking around a ball if it's just a trophy? This is like but this is where we should go back to the Lacanian, that it's the dupes who are duped. It's the insistence on the kind of naivety here. Oh, it's just a trophy is precisely the wrong way of viewing it. The trophy is everything. The trophy is simply the substitute for God. The trophy is the signifier without a signifier. Yes, it is simply a trophy. And yet, once you hold it in your hand, it is everything to you. It creates the umbrella, the master signifier, to which everything else has meaning. In this sense, the athlete is as happy as the ascetic, as happy as the monk, as happy as the person who dedicates themselves to their children, as happy as the religious fundamentalist, the person who has a true cause that can be imbued into one thing. The problem, of course, is the plague of fantasies. Namely, if we don't have a trophy, a child, a god, a thing that is, strictly speaking, just the thing that we've imbued the central purpose of our existence with, that is when we are attacked by doubts, by anxieties. What if your trophy could be somebody else's trophy? Think about it. Think about an athlete who wants to hold the trophy in their hands and then thinks to himself, but what if I had dedicated my life to something else? What if I had put the same intensity that I put into dribbling a ball into building houses or something like this? That is the plague of fantasies. It's that which seems to undermine or corrupt the thing, the immutable abstract thing that stitches together your reality and therefore your subjective investment in it. And to go back to Žižek's critique of ideology, what ideology does, therefore, is to give you trophies, to give you seemingly immutable, empty objects around which you can latch your entire identity and subjective investment. Think about fan culture. That's what fan culture is. I am a Game of Thrones person, or a Marvel person, a DC person. I'm an Apple person. I'm a PC person. These are all ways of trying to surmount the problem of the plague of fantasy. Here's this abstract thing, a commodity, that somehow is supposed to tell you about who you are and signal that to other people. That's ludicrous. And yet we do it because it gives us a temporary respite from the suffering that we experience when we don't know who we are, when we're subject to the plague of fantasies. And even if you're totally committed to one thing, think about it. If you decide tomorrow morning you're going to wake up and you're going to dedicate your entire life to, I don't know, reading every philosophy book or becoming really buff in the gym, the most dangerous point is the point when you're halfway there and you start thinking to yourself, what if I dedicated myself this completely to something else? That is the plague of fantasies that comes back to bite you. And so how do you make your thing, your trophy, how do you make it immutable? How do you make it something that you will never doubt or never question? Žižek's answer to this is to make the trophy something which is completely abstract that can never be reached. And what is the name of something completely abstract that can never be reached, that only gains in power the more it becomes abstract? Well, the name is the commodity. The commodity is that which exists only in its abstraction from the physical material thing. This is the irony about the Marxist critique, and why when people say that Marx materialized Hegel, they're actually seeing it the opposite way. Marx's materialism is never to say, let's look at physical material reality, things as they are. It's the exact opposite. It's to say, how is it that physical reality becomes imbued with this absolute idealism of the commodity fetish? How is it that something becomes so valuable when it is really just an ordinary object? And so what happens within ideology and within capitalism is that as the object of the commodity is elevated to the sublime, we therefore have that which allows us a complete subjective investment in the incentive structures of capitalism, which of course we used to call bourgeois ideology, namely the incentive structures by which you practice your life as an obedient, observant bourgeois subject, a middle-class, hardworking, Protestant, ethically imbued subject. And now you can actually understand, if you've gone through all these steps, the title of Žižek's most famous work, The Sublime Object of Ideology. What is the object which is being elevated to the level of the sublime, which is infused by the ideological structure, which gives order to the chaos of your desires, which silences the voice of the plague of fantasy? What is that object? It is the commodity. It is the commodity fetish. The commodity is the sublime object of ideology that allows your subjective investment in capitalism to continue to flourish so that you are never plagued by the plague of fantasies. And that therefore, for Žižek, in a sense, the plague of fantasies is what hystericizes the subject. The plague of fantasies, from a Lacanian perspective, is not an entirely bad thing. That the way in which Žižek interprets Lacanian psychoanalysis is that the primary gesture of psychoanalysis is to hystericize the psychotic subject. The psychotic subject is the one who believes completely, who is completely slavishly attached to his thing, to his sublime object, to the trophy. It means everything to him. That your bank account or your number or the amount of bitcoins you have says everything about you. You're perfectly, slavishly happy because you have found the thing to chase. And that the Lacanian psychoanalyst therefore has to hystericize you, has to find the thing that undermines this. And of course, the reason why you would do this, apart from you don't want to torture your patients, is to say that if fundamentally, let me actually put it like this. The problem with the sublime object of ideology within capitalism, the trophy that you can hunt and therefore be assuaged by the plague of fantasy, the problem is that you are never fully happy. You're never fully complete. There's always going to be a return of the repressed. There's always going to be that symptomatic part, what Gramsci called a morbid symptom that emerges. And of course, the morbid symptom for Marx is alienated life. It is the lingering unhappiness that we experience by the means of turning ourselves essentially into commodities as well, envisioning our life as the physical manifestation of the commodity fetish. And that therefore, finally, the Lacanian psychoanalytic principle of hystericizing the subject is precisely to pull the subject out of this fantasy, to, in a sense, topple the icons, the statues that present themselves as natural to you, that guide and govern the way in which you construct and construe your own subjectivity. In other words, that if you want to change the subject, you don't change the subject an sich. You change the fantasy that structures the subject. And therefore, from a Žižekian Marxist perspective, if from within Lacanian psychoanalysis, reality is supplemented by fantasy, not as an addition to reality, but that reality can only be accessed through fantasy, then the only way to change reality is precisely to change the fantasy. That if you change the fantasy, therefore reality itself changes. Hence, why from a Žižekian perspective, psychoanalysis has to be connected to the Marxist theory of revolution. That the only way to change the existing order, to change the governing ideology, is therefore to not eliminate the ideology, but to change the ideology. And when you've changed the ideological investment of the subject, in other words, if you've changed the fantasy frame, not only will the subject change, but reality itself will change. That's the final, most provocative argument that Žižek makes throughout all of his books, that the way to change reality is precisely to change the subjective fantasy, which means to change the subject's stance apropos his or her ideology. The primary step of which is to understand and examine ideology as such, the critique of ideology. That is the entire argument of The Plague of Fantasies. Thank you guys so much for joining me. I know it's been a lot, but I hope you've enjoyed it. If you'd like to download my bite-sized introduction to Žižek ebook, which is really quite short, it's less than 100 pages, you can find that on my Patreon. That's www.patreon.com/GentleLaneandJulian. If you're an Instagram subscriber, thank you so much. We're going to be hosting a live Q&A after this session. You can join me, ask me any questions you want about art, about literature, about philosophy, about politics, about anything really. Thank you so much for being here today. I will see you in 10 minutes. Thanks, guys.